Okay, so here we are on our DBQ for time period 6, and you can see that the prompt starts with a statement: the politics of the Gilded Age failed to deal with the critical social and economic issues of the time. Your task is to assess the validity of this statement using both the documents and your knowledge of U.S. history. All right, so as we start off with contextualization, right, set the context for the Industrial Revolution, the post-Civil War era, how the Civil War served as a catalyst. And now, while we had already experienced a shift towards the market and a shift towards manufacturing and the factory system during the market revolution, now all of a sudden it is going to grow exponentially. Production is going to become much more mechanized, much more specialized on a scale unlike anything else. You can set the stage for all of the advantages that the United States had: the natural resources, the free political and economic climate, the entrepreneurial spirit. And even say, like, look, this is an era where GDP grows at 4% a year. By 1900, the United States is outproducing the next 3 leading industrial countries combined. There's a million different ways that you can introduce this, and also introduce that there are 3 things that go along at the same time: industrialization, urbanization, and immigration, which cause a lot of change. And, as you look at, social and economic issues, the issue is we see an increase in economic inequality, which, again, that's a relative judgment on your part. I'm not trying to force some sort of doctrine down your throat, but it is a rising issue in that you see an intense concentration of wealth in a few hands, and political power and economic power that accompanies that. So as you look at these documents, the first one from James Bryce, and again, don't panic if you don't recognize a name. Nobody's going to know who James Bryce is, but here he is, a future British ambassador that's writing in an American publication, that if you read his document, he's like, once the Civil War came and went, like, all kinds of people that used to crusade for reform, like, especially in the context of being anti-slavery, now all of a sudden everybody seems content to just sit back. And you can bring in, if you didn't bring it in your introduction, that there's a tremendous amount of wealth that is being created, whether you cite the GDP number that's rising again 4% per year, or you talk about, there is a lot of progress. What did we say about 1900 America? The average American is more educated, better fed, lives longer, better paid than everybody else in the world. But as this guy looks at it, he sees it as, well, everybody's just kind of content with the status quo, and all these politicians that used to take up the cause of reform with slavery now aren't doing anything. And here's where you could bring in, the outside piece of evidence of, knife edge politics, where party was the most important thing. Rather than enact any real reform or tackle any real issue, it was, let's get out the vote, let's get everybody here, and we will use the doling out of patronage to get people to participate politically. And you can, bring it into the idea of, party is identity politics, much more so than it is anything that is issue based. And you can also bring in the notion of, knife edge politics, that there's a very delicate balance, and we usually have a Democratic president and Republican Congress, or vice versa. The only time that the Congress and the executive were the same party were the first 2 years of the Harrison administration. Very good. Okay. Now, where we look at Henry Demarest Floyd, financial writer and social reformer. Okay, so now we can put things in the context. He's anti-monopoly. And we've talked at great length about the trusts and how much power they gained, and it was all legal. Here's where you can bring in the consolidation for economies of scale. Standard Oil, 90%, American Tobacco, 90% of the market, U.S. Steel, 2/3 of the market, International Harvester, 2/3 of the market. And it became increasingly difficult for small business to compete. And as those trusts had so much political power and money, it became very difficult to challenge them. You can also bring in, our young man can no longer go west. They must move up or down. You could bring in the closing of the American frontier. And I know that that's not until 1890, but this idea that if you were dissatisfied, you can't just light out for the territories and try to make it on your own. So you definitely want to put this in the context of the anti-monopoly movement. And you can bring in the Sherman Antitrust Act that really ended up not doing much of anything because of the US v. EC Knight case. That would be a great piece of outside evidence there. The bosses of the Senate, here's a cupcake for you. The populist movement, and even going all the way back to the Ocala platform of 1890, we're calling for the direct election of US senators. Remember, one of the downsides of ending the spoils system and patronage through the Pendleton Act was now it was pretty much money that was dominating politics if you couldn't get about jobs. The Senate's not directly elected. They are appointed by the state legislators, and those are under the control of political machines. You could even bring in political machines as outside information. But it's the idea that there's no real reform, whether it's the Interstate Commerce Act, whether it is the Sherman Act, that the monopolists have just become too powerful and every major industry has become monopolized. And of course, this cartoon becomes irrelevant with the passage of the 17th Amendment, triple check my year, I think it's 1913, which gave the direct election of US senators. All right, Interstate Commerce Act. So we talked about, trying to bring in more stuff here, the Granger laws, right? And in Monroe, Illinois in 1877, Granger laws that regulated railroad rates were upheld as constitutional. The next 9 years later in 1886 in the Wabash case, it was ruled that was the control of railroads was only subject to the regulation of the federal government. And, you can talk about, particularly farmers are so upset with railroads because they're inherently monopolistic. And after the Panic of 1873, there's really only seven major rail carriers, and many of them have interlocking directories. They're basically controlled by J.P. Morgan. And the Interstate Commerce Act, which, if you look at Section 3, it banned rebates, but that proved to be very difficult to enforce because the rebate system was how J.D. Rockefeller was able to build so much of his oil monopoly. Ida Tarbell, in her book, The History of Standard Oil, I know I'm getting ahead of myself for progressives, she writes the one advantage that Rockefeller had, it costs the same to basically refine oil, but he could move it at a cheaper price. And she blamed the rebate system. Section 4 talks about overcharging for short hauls versus long hauls, which many local farmers were subject to. And the big idea from the Interstate Commerce Act is that it's the federal government, remember this is the first federal regulatory agency, had to make sure railroad rates were reasonable and just. And as we talked about when we reviewed this, the big impact of the Interstate Commerce Act was not any rapid reform of the railroads, but with more of the standardization of rates, it prevented a lot of destructive competition, and railroads were still doing just fine as the rates still continued to benefit them. And farmers were still upset by them, which is shown by the Populist Party calling in the 1892 Omaha platform for federal government ownership of the railroads. Document number 5 is, if you really want to get after it, you can talk about how with no real federal oversight of labor, it's up to each state. And here's New York talking about its archaic apprenticeship system for young boys, a law that was passed in 1871. And they're talking about, the changing nature of work. And you can bring in the factory system, you can bring in specialization. You could bring in, as outside information here, Andrew Carnegie and the puddlers and skilled labor going away. Because if you read this, they're like, we have a law on the books that allows for boys to be apprenticed to learn a trade. But in the new factory system, there's no trade to learn. You sit at one machine and do one job. It's like the Bessemer process made the puddlers obsolete, as we saw a structural change in manufacturing completely away from skilled artisan labor. Document 6, you can put in Dr. Stowe, you can put into the larger context of immigration, right? And you can bring in any numbers of immigration and talk about how, in just about every industrial city, at least half of the workforce was first or second generation immigrant. In Chicago and New York, 3/4 of the industrial workforce or first or second generation immigrant. And here's the doctor saying, you work long hours, in a factory, your health is hurt. And here you can bring in all the stuff that we learned about the steel industry, right? And you can bring in You know, the 364 days, 12-hour shifts, right? The guy who drank water out of a bucket, right? He sweated out 40 pounds almost immediately. And all of the accidents that happened. You could cite the accident rates that we learned during our industrial unit, talking about the 22,000 accidents in a 30-year period in the railroad industry, the high numbers in coal mines or in steel mills, and how there's no worker compensation during this time. And there are no laws passed at all on the federal level that deal with working conditions. And when workers tried to challenge the prevailing system, whether it was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Pullman Strike of 1894, the Homestead Strike of 1892, the state always came down and sided with ownership. So strikes were not very effective to try to address working conditions. And so here, like, we now have the Populist Party, and you could bring in, you know, in 1896 with the fusion of the Democrats, we actually have a real election between the Republicans and the Democrats in 1896, where, you know, the Populists, you know, if you wanted to smush this, bring in, you know, the Omaha platform says that the country's been divided into two camps, tramps and millionaires, right? Because it really hammers home that idea of a growing income gap. And the populists say this is all fake. You know, there's nobody touches the real issues. There's a petty difference between the two sides on the tariff. But, you know, the real issues here, you know, is they talk about corporations, banks, rings, trusts, watered stock, and of course the big issue. And you could bring in, you know, a problem was, you know, the value of the dollar went up 300%. There's significant deflation. And that becomes a major issue that the populists finally addressed by running in 1896 on the 16-to-1 coinage of silver issue. So that's you know, the stuff that I could think of that you would want to bring in for that. And then of course, you know, when you talk about, if I were to write a conclusion here, you know, I would write my conclusion all about the progressive era, right? And how in the early 20th century with the progressive era, there actually are changes. And whether you would talk about, you know, the Adamson Act or the Keating-Owens Act, the 17th Amendment, the 16th Amendment with income tax, you know, whatever the case may be, I think because you actually do see some progressive change. You know, Teddy Roosevelt actually used the Sherman Act to break up Northern securities. Whatever the case may be, I think that would be a really good link to make into your conclusion that we do see a really organized political movement that cuts across both the Democrat and the Republican Party in the early 20th century. The progressive movement, we have two progressive presidents, Wilson and we have Roosevelt, and they enact a lot of the legislation that reformers wanted then to deal with the excessive problems created by industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. And the idea was, rather than to have a revolution from below, there would be reform from above. So hopefully that helped you out and you got something out of trying to look at these documents from this time period. Once again, if you submit this to me, I will, of course, make comments on it and return it to you.